When a raging Montana storm traps a wild bobcat kitten on a drowning rock, only one soul is brave enough to leap into the river. Rusty, a loyal German shepherd. But this rescue sparks a fight not just against nature, but against human cruelty hiding in the shadows. Will courage and compassion be enough when the wild turns deadly? Tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe every life is worth saving, like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. Montana's forests could turn wild in an instant. Claire Thompson knew that better than anyone. As a park ranger for nearly 20 years, she'd seen blizzards swallow trails and thunderstorms flatten whole groves. But nothing ever felt routine about the way a storm could rise up from the mountains, seething and howling, turning the familiar into something fearsome. Tonight, as she sat beside the crackling fire in her small log cabin, a low growl of thunder rolled through the valley, rattling the windows. Her German shepherd, Rusty, lifted his head, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the door, as if he could sense the trouble stirring outside. The wind began to lash at the roof, howling through the pines. Rain hammered the glass so fiercely, it seemed the sky itself had cracked.
What kind
Claire
of
set
monster
aside
would
her
do
half-written
this?
report and moved to the window. Beyond the porch, the yard sloped down to a narrow, fast-moving river, a silver ribbon by daylight, now a black, seething snake swollen with storm runoff. Lightning tore open the darkness, revealing the battered remains of the old wooden bridge. Claire's heart thudded as she realized just how much the river had risen. The bridge, which had survived so many seasons, now leaned at an impossible angle, its beams creaking and groaning as the current gnawed away at the supports. Rusty began to pace, restless and uneasy, his nails clicking on the hardwood. The storm was only getting worse. Claire's mind flickered with the memory of last winter's flash floods, the way the current had snatched up fallen logs, even a deer, and tossed them downstream as if they weighed nothing. She grabbed her rain slicker, feeling the electric edge of fear sharpen her senses. There was nothing to do but wait for the worst to pass, she told herself. Just another wild night in the woods. Then, just as she turned away, another flash of lightning painted the world in stark relief. Out on the largest rock in the center of the torrent, a place that would normally be unreachable even in summer, something moved. At first, Claire thought it was a branch or a clump of debris, but as she stared, she saw it. A tiny shape, drenched and trembling, clinging to the slippery stone. The next bolt of lightning revealed the stripes and spots, the tufted ears, a bobcat kitten, no older than a few months, trapped by the rising river. For a split second, Claire's thoughts tumbled in a blur. How did it get there? Was its mother nearby, or had the storm separated them? She could already see the water licking higher up the rock, the kitten's eyes wide with terror, its tiny body flattened against the stone as the wind whipped spray into its face. The current was monstrous, far too strong for any human to cross. Claire felt helpless, rooted to the spot by the force of the elements and the impossible odds. Rusty, however, was already moving. One moment he was at her side, the next, he'd slipped out the half-open door into the storm. Claire shouted his name, her voice lost in the roar of the wind and water. She scrambled after him, rain slashing across her face, boots sinking into mud. On the riverbank, she spotted Rusty, tail high, muscles taut, staring down the river as if measuring the distance. Another flash, and before Claire could stop him, Rusty plunged into the raging water. "Rusty!" she screamed, terror crackling through her like the lightning overhead. The river seized him instantly, twisting and tumbling him, but the dog fought with every ounce of strength, head up, eyes locked on the stranded kitten. The sight burned into Claire's memory, a silhouette of loyalty and courage, framed by the wild, merciless storm. Each second felt endless as Rusty battled the current. The river surged, hungry and relentless, snatching at him with icy fingers. Claire's lungs burned as she ran along the bank, searching for something, anything that could help. Her hands found the old coil of rope beside the porch, used for hauling supplies, or once for pulling a calf from the mud. She knotted it around her waist, praying the knot would hold if she needed to jump in herself. Out on the rock, the kitten crouched lower, its desperate cries barely audible above the storm. Rusty lunged, paws scrabbling against the slick stone, jaws gently closing around the scruff of the kitten's neck. For a moment, dog and wildcat locked eyes, united by the pure, instinctive will to survive. But the river would not let them go so easily. As Rusty turned, the water surged higher, threatening to sweep them both away. Claire hurled the rope, her hands numb, her aim wild in the wind. Rusty seized the end with his teeth, dragging himself and the kitten toward the bank, inch by painful inch. Claire braced herself, pulling with all her might, feeling the river's pull in her arms, her chest, her bones. The world narrowed to the desperate struggle at the river's edge. Dog, cat, and human locked together against the storm. Thunder cracked overhead, illuminating the scene in a blinding flash. For a heartbeat, Claire saw it all. Rusty's soaked fur, the wild terror in the kitten's eyes, the roiling water that threatened to claim them. Then, with one final wrenching effort, Rusty clawed his way onto the muddy bank, the kitten dangling limply from his jaws. Claire dropped to her knees, grabbing them both, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it would burst. For a moment, none of them moved. The storm howled on, indifferent to the miracle that had just played out in its shadow. But as Claire gathered Rusty and the kitten into her arms, she realized nothing would ever be the same again. She had witnessed courage that night, the kind that made legends, the kind that would test everything she thought she knew about loyalty, love, and the wildness of nature. And somewhere, deep inside, a question echoed, refusing to be silenced. Would Rusty's bravery be enough to save them all? Or would the river claim its due before dawn? The wind shrieked around her, and Claire clutched the trembling bobcat kitten against her chest, feeling its frantic heartbeat thunder beneath its sodden fur. Rusty slumped beside her, panting, his ribs heaving with exhaustion, but his eyes bright and alert, watching the storm with a vigilance that could not be taught, only earned in 100 wild nights like this. Claire's slicker was soaked through, the mud seeping into her jeans, but she barely noticed. All that mattered now was the fragile bundle in her arms and the dog who had risked everything to bring it back. The storm showed no sign of relenting. Rain pelted down, drumming on the metal roof of the porch, as Claire half-carried, half-dragged Rusty and the kitten inside. She fumbled with the latch, nearly dropping the kitten as a fresh gust slammed the door shut behind them. The warm light of the cabin seemed impossibly distant from the chaos outside, but for a few blessed moments, it was enough. Claire laid the kitten on a soft towel by the stove, where the heat could seep into its chilled body. Rusty collapsed on the rug, shivering, but nudged closer to the kitten, his broad head resting protectively near its side. Claire moved quickly, grabbing another towel, wrapping it around Rusty and drying his fur with gentle hands. Her mind raced. What now? Was the kitten hurt? How long had it been stranded out there, She'd need to call the wildlife center, but with the phone lines likely down and the roads washed out, she was on her own. For now, all she could do was try to save this small, wild life that fate had dropped, quite literally, on her doorstep. Outside, the river continued to rage. Claire stole a glance through the window, watching as the last remnants of the old bridge finally gave way, torn apart by the current and swept into the darkness. That bridge had stood for decades, but tonight, it was gone. Just like that. She wondered what else the storm might take before it was finished, but inside, something new had begun. The kitten, barely bigger than Claire's outstretched hand, stirred and let out a faint, rasping cry. Rusty responded instantly, licking its ear with a tenderness that made Claire's throat ache. She knelt beside them, her fingers trembling not from cold, but from adrenaline and awe. Never in all her years had she witnessed anything like this. A wild animal, saved by a dog, both saved by the stubborn, reckless hope that maybe, just maybe, some things could be rescued from the teeth of the storm. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the room. Claire leaned back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees, listening to the wind and the rain and the soft, shuddering breaths of her two charges. She knew the hardest part was still to come. The kitten was wild, unpredictable, and desperate. Rusty was brave, but not invincible. And the river would be waiting, always, just beyond the porch, ready to test their luck again. But tonight, they had survived. Tonight, in the heart of the storm, courage and compassion had won, if only for a little while. And as the night wore on, Claire found herself wide awake, staring into the darkness, asking a question that she knew had no easy answer. What would she be willing to risk, and what would she have to lose, to protect the wild and fragile lives that called this place home? Would love, loyalty, and a little luck be enough to save them again when the storm returned? She didn't know, but she was certain of one thing. The story was only just beginning. Dawn crept over the horizon, tentative and gray, streaking the storm clouds with pale silver. Inside the cabin, Claire barely slept, ears tuned to every twitch and sound. The wild night still lingered, her muscles ached, her mind replayed the frantic rescue in endless loops. As the wind finally subsided, she rose stiffly and moved to the stove, lighting it with trembling fingers. The warmth radiated outward, chasing away the last vestiges of chill. On the worn rug, Rusty lay stretched beside the wood stove, eyes half closed but never straying far from the tiny bundle curled next to him. The Bobcat Kitten slept uneasily, breath hitching, claws kneading the towel. It was a miracle the little creature had survived at all. Wild animals rarely fared well in the hands of storms or men. Claire knew better than to interfere too much, but she couldn't help herself. Carefully, she prepared a bowl of warm water and placed it near the kitten, watching as its nose twitched, drawn by the scent. She didn't expect the kitten to drink. Not yet. It was still wild, still lost in the terror of last night's river. Yet when it finally cracked open one eye, blinking in the light, its first instinct was to nuzzle closer to Rusty, as if the dog was the only solid thing in a world that had turned unpredictable and violent. It took all Claire's resolve not to reach out, not to gather the fragile animal into her arms. Instead, she let the moment unfold. Rusty inching nearer, tongue gently brushing the kitten's sodden fur. The kitten relaxing by degrees until it let out a faint sigh and pressed into his side. The bond formed in the darkness was holding. It was something rare, something precious and precarious, Outside, the world was a mess. The storm had transformed the landscape overnight. The bridge was gone, replaced by a swirling mass of debris. The trees leaned at odd angles, some uprooted, their roots exposed like bones. Mud coated everything, thick and slippery, making every step an effort. Claire trudged to the riverbank, eyes scanning for any sign of life or loss. No tracks, no sign of the kitten's mother. Just the aftermath of chaos and the endless rush of water. Back inside, she tried the radio. Static. She tried her cell phone. Dead. The phone line was as useless as the road, and for the first time in years, she felt the isolation close around her like a fist. There would be no help coming, no wildlife officers to take over. She was on her own. Rusty stayed vigilant, barely moving except to nudge the kitten awake when it whimpered, or to curl around it when the wind rattled the window pane. Claire fetched her old veterinary kit, the one she kept for emergencies, and set to work. She dabbed gently at the kitten's paws, checking for cuts or broken bones. It squirmed, tiny muscles taut, but Rusty's presence seemed to soothe it. There were no visible injuries, just bruises and a ragged edge of fear that clung stubbornly to the creature. Claire's own nerves refused to settle. She forced herself to focus on practicalities: food, warmth, and water. She rummaged through the pantry, pulling out a can of evaporated milk, diluting it with water, and filling a small syringe. With infinite patience, she offered it to the kitten, who sniffed at it, uncertain, then latched on, hunger finally winning out over caution. Watching it feed, Claire felt a wave of relief wash through her. As the sun rose higher, slicing through the clouds, she dared to hope the worst was over. She would call the Wildlife Rescue Center again as soon as the roads opened. Surely someone would come. Until then, she'd do her best. For a few peaceful hours, the world seemed to hold its breath. Rusty dozed, chin on his paws. The kitten drifted into sleep, safe and warm at last. But peace never lasted long in the wild. By mid-afternoon, a low growl rose from the edge of the forest, followed by a thin, unearthly howl. Wolves, driven by hunger and the promise of easy prey, were on the move. Claire froze, every instinct screaming at her to protect what she had rescued. Rusty leapt to his feet, hackles raised, teeth bared at the closed door. The howl came again, closer this time, winding through the trees and echoing down the valley. The Bobcat Kitten bolted upright, fur bristling, eyes wild with remembered terror. In a flash it lashed out, claws raking Rusty's muzzle in blind panic. Rusty recoiled but didn't retaliate, keeping himself between the kitten and the door as the howls faded into uneasy silence. Claire's heart hammered as she watched the two animals, one wild, one domestic, caught between their natures and their new, fragile alliance. She understood then. From this moment on, their fates were entwined, for better or worse. The kitten needed them, but it also brought new dangers into their lives. The woods were no longer safe. The river was no longer the greatest threat. Everything had changed. That night, as darkness settled over the cabin and the wind rattled the shutters, Claire wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and sat beside Rusty and the kitten, determined to keep watch until morning. She didn't know what challenges the next day would bring, but she knew she wouldn't face them alone. In the heart of Montana's wild forest, 3 lives had been bound together by a single reckless act of courage, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning broke clean and bright, as if the storm had been nothing but a terrible dream. Sunlight slanted through the battered pines, illuminating the mud and debris the night had left behind. Claire awoke stiff and exhausted in her armchair, the blanket tangled around her legs. For a moment, she almost believed the nightmare was over, that peace had returned to the valley. The air was crisp, fresh with the scent of wet earth and pine sap, a deceptive calm settling over the landscape. The Bobcat Kitten was the first to stir. With a tentative stretch and a soft, plaintive sound, it blinked against the sudden brightness, scanning its new world with cautious wonder. But when it spotted Rusty, sprawled nearby in a protective half-circle, it did not retreat. Instead, the kitten edged closer, almost burrowing into the warmth of his side. In that quiet dawn, the boundaries between wild and tame seemed to blur. Claire watched this fragile trust with a mix of hope and worry. She knew wild animals sometimes imprinted on those who saved them, especially when fear and hunger were stronger than instinct. Yet, beneath the tenderness, a sense of unease gnawed at her. The woods were never truly safe, and even the calmest mornings could turn. With renewed purpose, Claire rose and moved quietly about the cabin. She changed out the towels beneath the kitten, reheated some milk, and coaxed it to drink. Rusty watched with steady, loyal eyes, accepting the scratch on his muzzle as a small price for the bond that was forming. Claire carefully noted the kitten's movements, looking for any sign of injury or illness. Every twitch and tremor mattered out here, miles from any help. After a hasty breakfast, she tried the radio again. Static filled the room, relentless and hollow. With a resigned sigh, Claire switched to her cell phone. No service, no signal. The world outside was cut off, and the rescue center was just as unreachable as the day before. She leaned against the counter, considering her options. With the bridge swept away and the roads likely blocked for miles, she was trapped with her two unlikely charges. She forced herself outside, taking stock of the land. Trees had fallen across the trail, their roots torn from the earth. Deep gouges scarred the riverbank. A heap of driftwood and debris marked the place where the old bridge had stood. All of it spoke to the storm's violence and the fragile balance that defined life in these woods. Inside the cabin, the mood was deceptively calm. The kitten, still weak, began to follow Rusty around, padding behind him on oversized paws. At first, Rusty seemed bemused by his new shadow, but soon he grew used to the small presence that clung to his side. The kitten watched everything, eyes wide, body pressed low to the ground, as if expecting danger at any moment. That afternoon, as sunlight warmed the clearing and the worst of the mud dried to a thin crust, Claire began to hope the crisis had passed. Perhaps, she thought, the rescue team would find a way through soon. Perhaps, with rest and care, the kitten would regain its strength and could be released back to the wild. For a while, the three of them drifted through the day in uneasy peace. But as dusk fell, shadows gathered in the forest, lengthening and deepening with each passing minute. The temperature dropped sharply, and a sense of unease crept in. Claire fed Rusty and tried to tempt the kitten with a scrap of cooked chicken, but the animal seemed restless, skittish, unable to settle. Its wild instincts were surfacing. The storm had only buried them for a night. Suddenly, from deep within the trees, a chorus of howls echoed across the valley. Wolves, hungry and bold in the aftermath of the storm, prowled closer, their voices carrying on the cold air. The sound was primal, a chilling reminder that the wild always lurked just beyond the door. Rusty stood, muscles tensed, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The kitten arched its back, fur standing on end, eyes wide with terror. In a blur of panic, the Bobcat Kitten lashed out, claws flashing as it scrambled away from the door. It crashed into a corner, hissing and spitting, wild again in the face of danger. Rusty approached cautiously, but the kitten raked his muzzle with sharp claws, drawing blood. Claire stepped between them, heart pounding, torn between the need to protect and the knowledge that she was out of her depth. The howls continued, closer now, circling the cabin, a promise and a threat in the darkness. Claire realized with a jolt that keeping a wild animal inside 4 wooden walls might prove more dangerous than the river ever had. Wolves, fear, and the unbreakable call of instinct, the boundaries were closing in. She barricaded the door, checked the windows, and sat beside the stove with Rusty and the kitten, determined to see the night through. Sleep was a distant dream. Every sound outside, a snapping branch, a shifting shadow, set Claire's nerves on edge. Inside, the kitten crouched close to Rusty, trembling, its wild eyes never leaving the door. Rusty remained vigilant, keeping himself between the kitten and whatever prowled beyond. The storm might have passed, but the danger had only changed shape. For Claire, there was no illusion of safety left, only the hard truth that in the wild, every day was a new test of courage, luck, and trust. As the wind picked up again, rattling the eaves, she promised herself she would do whatever it took to keep her fragile little family safe, come what may. The next morning dawned with a pale, uncertain light that barely warmed the soaked land. For Claire, the night had passed in tense, broken fragments, ears straining for the sounds of prowling wolves, eyes darting to every shifting shadow in the corners of the cabin. When she finally opened the door, the world outside was still and hushed, as if the forest itself was catching its breath after days of violence. The air was sharp with the scent of pine sap and mud, and faint animal tracks patterned the soft earth around the porch. Claire moved quietly, her steps instinctively careful. Rusty followed at her side, his energy returning, though his eyes flicked constantly toward the tree line as if daring danger to show itself again. She scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the bobcat's mother, but there was nothing. Just wind in the treetops and the distant rush of the swollen river. Each step she took felt heavier, burdened by responsibility. The bond that had formed between the dog and the wild kitten was undeniable, but she could not ignore the reality. The wild would always call to its own. That day, she set out to patrol the edges of her territory. Fallen trees blocked parts of the trail. The forest floor was littered with debris left behind by the storm. Claire's trained eyes picked out something unusual near an old game trail. A steel trap, half buried in mud and pine needles. Its jaws rusted but still lethal. Nearby, she found empty shell casings, footprints stamped deep into the earth, and the unmistakable stench of rotting meat used as bait. Her stomach twisted. Poachers, emboldened by the chaos of the storm, had come to hunt in the confusion. She made a mental note to report the evidence as soon as the lines reopened, feeling a new layer of dread settle over her. She hurried back to the cabin, thoughts swirling with worry. The sun had shifted, throwing long shadows across the clearing. Rusty barked as she approached, but his voice sounded different, sharper, more urgent. Claire's heart sank as she rounded the corner and saw the door hanging open, one wooden hinge dangling uselessly. The storm, it seemed, had done more damage than she realized. She rushed inside, the cold air biting at her face, calling out for Rusty and the kitten. The cabin was empty. Panic surged through her. She found Rusty at the edge of the yard, sniffing the ground, circling, nose pressed to the muddy earth. It didn't take long to see what had happened. The Bobcat Kitten, frightened and restless, had slipped out through the broken door. Driven by its wild instinct, or maybe simply by the overwhelming need for freedom, it had left the safety of the cabin and vanished into the trees. Claire's heart pounded as she scanned the ground, searching for any clue. There, pressed into the soft mud, were tiny paw prints, spaced unevenly but unmistakable. The prints zigzagged away from the house, through the trampled grass, and toward the tangled shadows beneath the pines. She followed them, each step sinking deeper into dread. The kitten was still too young, still too weak, to survive alone out here. Worse, it was heading straight for danger, the very trap lines she'd discovered that morning. The forest felt colder, darker, as Claire plunged in after the tracks. Rusty kept close, his head low, body tense with purpose. The world shrank to the size of those fragile prints, a record of uncertainty and desperation winding deeper into the wild. Every now and then, the trail vanished in a patch of weeds or under a fallen branch, but Claire would pause, breathe, and look again, always finding the next mark pressed into the soil or dusted over by a bit of last night's snow. She moved faster as the shadows deepened, the trees closing in around her. The knowledge of poachers in these woods, men who left their cruel traps and waited, silent and hidden, gnawed at her nerves. Her every sense sharpened, picking up the faintest snap of a twig or whisper of wind. The prints began to veer from the familiar trails, heading toward a patch of dense underbrush where the air grew heavy and the forest felt especially ancient and watchful. Claire stopped, chest heaving, and listened. Somewhere up ahead, a crow cawed, a harsh, echoing sound that made her flinch. She pushed on, shoving branches aside, mud splattering her boots, her mind running through every worst-case scenario. What if she was too late? What if the kitten stumbled into a snare, or a poacher's path, or a hungry wolf's jaws? The possibilities twisted in her gut, urging her on even as exhaustion threatened to drag her down. Finally, at the edge of a small clearing, she spotted a faint drag in the mud. The kitten had slipped, maybe paused to rest, then pressed on. Beyond, the prints led straight toward a cluster of rocks and the shadowy mouth of an old animal trail, one she knew all too well from her years patrolling these woods. It was poacher territory, a place she avoided unless absolutely necessary. The cold dread in her stomach solidified into certainty. The kitten was walking into a death trap. Claire hesitated only a moment before plunging in after it, Rusty at her side, her mind racing with a single desperate hope: that she would find the little creature before the wild, or the cruel, found it first. The forest seemed to close behind her, the wind dying away, the hush of impending danger thick as snow. In that moment, Claire realized just how far they had come, and how much further they still had to go. The wild did not easily surrender its own, and the line between rescue and loss had never felt thinner. Snow fell in ghostly swirls as Claire pushed deeper into the forest, her heart thumping with fear and urgency. Every breath stung in the cold air, and every shadow felt heavy with unseen eyes. Rusty moved ahead, nose close to the ground, tracking the kitten's scent as though his own life depended on it. The forest, usually Claire's place of comfort and clarity, now pressed close around her, filled with unseen threats and traps. The kitten's paw prints became erratic, doubling back and weaving through thorny undergrowth. Once or twice, Claire thought she glimpsed a flash of movement, a tail or an ear vanishing behind a log, but it was always gone before she could call out. Each missed sighting tightened the knot in her stomach. She thought of the poacher's traps, set with ruthless precision, and the way the wild could change from sanctuary to predator in the blink of an eye. They moved with mounting desperation, pausing only when the tracks crossed a frozen stream or disappeared under a drift of wind-blown snow. Once, Rusty stopped dead and barked, a sharp warning. Claire hurried to his side and saw why. A patch of crimson on the white, a tiny drop of blood. The kitten was hurt or frightened into frenzy. The trail veered sharply, leading away from safety and toward the denser thicket Claire recognized from her earlier patrol. Poacher territory. Claire pressed on, forcing herself not to dwell on what could go wrong. Her world shrank to the evidence before her. Broken twigs, scraps of fur, the marks of a tiny struggle in the snow. Sometimes she felt the eyes of the forest on her, as if every branch and stone bore witness to this reckless mission. She remembered old stories, ones her father used to tell about the spirits of the land, how sometimes the wild would test a person, demanding everything for the chance to save something precious. Then, piercing the hush, a faint cry echoed through the trees. It was raw, desperate, a kitten's wail. Rusty answered with a low whine, ears up, muscles tensed. Claire's pulse raced. She ducked low, crawling through a tangle of brush and icy thorns until at last, she saw the tiny figure huddled against the base of a fallen tree. The bobcat kitten was caught, one back paw twisted in a crude wire snare. It struggled, fur fluffed out in terror, eyes wild with pain. Claire's breath caught. Poacher traps did not distinguish between fox, rabbit, or bobcat. She dropped to her knees, hands shaking, and whispered soothing words more for herself than the animal. Rusty stood watch, hackles raised, barking furiously as Claire worked to free the kitten. The wire had cut into flesh, and every second mattered. She dug through her pocket for her multi-tool, the cold biting into her skin, and sawed carefully at the snare until the twisted wire gave way. The kitten bolted into her arms, trembling. Blood stained the snow. Claire cradled it against her chest, already planning how to clean and bandage the wound once they made it home. For a fleeting second, relief threatened to overwhelm her. They had found the kitten. They could still save it. That hope was shattered by the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot, sharp and sudden, splitting the air like a thunderclap. Claire ducked instinctively, shielding the kitten. Rusty snarled, turning circles, ready to defend them. Another shot rang out, closer, echoing through the trees. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was a trap closing around them. The poachers had found their quarry, and now the hunter's eyes were turned on Claire and her animals. She caught a glimpse through the trees, shadows moving quickly, men in camouflage, rifles glinting. Fear and anger battled in her chest. She could not run and leave the kitten. She could not fight men armed and ruthless. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she could not abandon Rusty or the fragile life in her arms. She backed away, keeping her body between the men and the animals. Rusty circled, growling, his gaze fixed on the approaching danger. Claire scanned the trees for any sign of a path, any route back to the cabin, but every step forward was met with the threat of another gunshot. The men's voices were muffled, but their intentions were clear. They were not leaving without a prize. Desperation hardened into resolve. Claire knew running wouldn't be enough. If she wanted to save the kitten and herself, she would have to stand her ground. She remembered every lesson the woods had taught her over the years: how to move unseen, how to use the land itself as shield and weapon. She looked at Rusty, at the wounded kitten, and at the cold, indifferent forest that watched it all. She would fight, not just for the kitten, but for every wild creature threatened by cruelty and greed. The chase was over. Now it was time to take a stand. As the poachers closed in, Claire tightened her grip on the kitten and prepared to protect the fragile life she'd rescued, no matter the cost. The snow kept falling, muffling sound and swallowing tracks, as the wild set the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of courage and loyalty, of woman, dog, and the little survivor whose fate now hung in the balance. Claire knew the forest better than any outsider could. Every ridge, every hollow, every patch of tangled undergrowth was etched into her memory from years of solitary patrols and silent observation. Now all those lessons became her greatest weapon. The poachers were closing in, but the woods themselves might offer salvation if she moved swiftly and thought like prey. She cradled the trembling Bobcat Kitten against her chest, blood from its wounded leg staining her jacket, and slipped through the trees with Rusty at her heels. The air was sharp with cold and fear. Another shot rang out, splintering a branch overhead, but Claire ducked low, weaving between trunks, letting the shadows and uneven ground hide her. Rusty's instincts kicked in. He flanked her, ears pinned, every muscle straining as if he could shield her with the force of his will. Claire's mind raced. The cabin was too far and too exposed. The poachers were hunters, skilled at reading the forest, but they were also arrogant, believing that guns and numbers gave them control. She needed to turn that arrogance against them, to make them feel hunted instead. She found a shallow ravine, sheltered by fallen logs and dense shrubs. "Stay," she whispered to Rusty, guiding him and the kitten into the hollow. The dog understood, positioning himself over the kitten, body rigid and eyes fierce. Claire moved off, leaving her jacket in the brush as a decoy, hoping the splash of blood would fool anyone tracking them. She darted through the forest, doubling back and looping around, careful to leave subtle tracks, just enough to lead the poachers away. Her lungs burned from the cold, but she pressed on, recalling old lessons from her ranger days: how to set makeshift snares, how to use natural obstacles to slow pursuers. She snapped off low branches and set them across narrow game trails, tripping hazards for the unwary. She twisted wire, left behind by poachers themselves, into a snare at knee height, hoping desperation would make them careless. Back at the hollow, Rusty kept guard, his entire focus on the sounds around them. The kitten shivered, fear and pain overwhelming its tiny body, but Rusty licked its ears, offering the only comfort he could. The forest was full of muffled movement now. Boots on snow, distant curses, the metallic snap of a rifle bolt. The poachers were close. Claire climbed a low ridge and surveyed the terrain. The sun was setting, its light dying quickly behind the mountains, and the woods filled with long, shifting shadows. She pulled a flare from her emergency kit, a tool meant for signaling rescue, now pressed into service as a weapon. She rigged it above a narrow game trail, winding fishing line across the path at chest height. If the poachers followed her decoy, they'd trip the line and ignite a blaze of crimson smoke, disorienting them and announcing their location to anyone nearby. Her trap set, Claire slid back through the trees, breath frosting in the air, every sense tuned to the smallest sound. Night had fallen fast, cloaking the woods in darkness so complete it seemed to swallow even her fear. She found her way back to the ravine by memory, heart pounding as she listened for Rusty's low, reassuring growl. He was there, ever loyal, still guarding the wounded kitten with the silent promise of protection. The first of the poachers emerged from the shadows, flashlights slicing through the gloom. Claire's pulse leapt as she saw the barrel of a rifle glint. The men moved cautiously now, slowed by uncertainty. The red glow of her flare burst suddenly from the brush behind them, flooding the scene with shifting, angry light. Shouts broke out, confused, alarmed, echoing through the trees. One of the men, bolder than the rest, spotted movement in the ravine and raised his rifle at Rusty. The world seemed to freeze, every second stretching to an unbearable length. Claire's scream ripped through the night, but the gunshot came first, a deafening crack, followed by chaos. Rusty lunged, teeth bared, knocking the man's arm as the bullet flew wild. The poacher stumbled, sliding down the embankment, gun lost in the snow. Another flare ignited, casting everything in eerie red. The forest, for an instant, seemed on fire, smoke curling, light bouncing off the trees, transforming every shadow into a threat. Claire's traps began to work. One poacher tripped and went sprawling into a shallow pit, ensnared by wire and brambles. Others choked and coughed, eyes watering from the smoke. The animals huddled together, pressed to the ground, as men thrashed and shouted, their confidence unraveling in the face of the unexpected. In that frantic moment, Claire saw how the wild could turn, how knowledge, patience, and courage could outmatch brute force. She kept low, moving like a shadow, her eyes never leaving Rusty and the kitten. The plan was working, but the danger was far from over. With every flare, every snare, every howl in the darkness, the balance shifted. As night claimed the forest, the true test began, not just of survival, but of loyalty, cunning, and the power of wild things united by a single, desperate purpose. The chaos of the night grew thick and blinding. Crimson smoke coiled through the trees, painting the snow and underbrush in flickering red as the flares burned, casting everything into ghostly, distorted shadows. The poachers, no longer hunters but men stumbling through an unfamiliar battlefield, shouted and cursed as their confidence dissolved. The wild, it seemed, had turned against them, every sound magnified, every shadow a threat. Claire's mind moved with cold clarity. She watched as Rusty held his ground, body taut and bristling, eyes sharp and fixed on the poacher who had raised his rifle. Time slowed. The man hesitated, blinded by the thick, stinging smoke, and in that split second, Rusty charged. He moved like a living bolt. Muscle, fury, and loyalty fused into a single, unstoppable force. The poacher managed one startled step before Rusty collided with him, knocking him off his feet and sending him sprawling into the snow. The rifle tumbled from the man's grip and slid out of reach. Rusty snarled, but held his ground, teeth bared, eyes never leaving the poacher, who scrambled backward, his bravado now replaced by naked fear. Claire used the moment of confusion, darting through the underbrush to reach the Bobcat Kitten. She gathered it close, feeling the tremors that shook its tiny body. It was hurt, but its wild spirit remained unbroken. Suddenly, a second poacher burst through the thicket, swinging a heavy branch, eyes wild in the red flare-light. Claire ducked as the branch swiped past her shoulder, wood splintering against a rock. Rusty lunged, growling, but it was the Bobcat Kitten, small, wounded, but fierce, who surprised them all. With a desperate, guttural sound, The kitten leapt from Claire's arms and latched onto the poacher's arm, claws raking, tiny fangs sinking deep. The man howled in shock, stumbling backward. He tripped over one of Claire's snares and fell hard, tangled in wire and brush. The moment seemed to suspend itself. Predator and prey, wild and tame, all boundaries dissolved by the surge of survival and courage. Claire dropped beside the poacher, yanking the kitten free before it could be hurt further. Her traps and flares had worked, bought them time, sowed confusion, and turned the forest into a maze that only she, Rusty, and the wild creatures could navigate. In the burning red glow, Claire saw the other poachers hesitate. The sight of their comrades disarmed, tangled, and bested by a woman, a dog, and a wounded bobcat kitten broke their resolve. Some called out in retreat, slipping into the trees, boots crunching away into the darkness. The remaining men raised their hands, wary and beaten, unable to see who or what might strike next from the shadows. Claire kept herself between Rusty, the kitten, and the men. She could hear distant sirens now, the echoes of approaching backup, forest rangers summoned by her flares, and the thunder of gunshots. Help was coming. The forest, alive with echoes of conflict, now held its breath. Rusty herded the kitten close to Claire, his gaze flicking from the defeated men to the thicket beyond, always on guard. The kitten pressed into Claire's side, wild eyes wide, chest heaving with every breath. She pressed her hand gently to its side, whispering promises it would never understand, but somehow needed to hear. As the rangers arrived, flashlights bouncing over the snow and voices calling orders, Claire stepped back, letting them take control. The poachers were rounded up, weapons confiscated, wrists bound with plastic ties. The men barely protested. Their fight was gone, sapped by cold, confusion, and the uncanny resilience of their unlikely opponents. The aftermath unfolded slowly. Rangers examined the snares and traps Claire had set, nodding in approval at her resourcefulness. They praised Rusty, ruffling his fur, and spoke in low, reverent tones about the bobcat kitten's courage. The animal's attack on the poacher was recounted with awe, a tiny flash of wildness that had helped turn the tide. When the area was finally secure, Claire sank to her knees beside Rusty and the kitten. The night air was raw, filled with the smell of gunpowder and spent flares, but relief flooded her as she realized it was over. They had survived, not by brute force alone, but through loyalty, intelligence, and the wild, untamed courage that lay at the heart of every creature, domestic or wild. She looked at Rusty, mud and blood streaked across his side, yet his tail thumped softly as if to say, "We did it." The bobcat kitten, wounded and exhausted, lifted its head for a moment and gazed at Claire with bright, feral eyes. The night belonged once more to the forest and those who knew its secrets. Victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like a hard-earned, fragile peace. And as the last flare burned out and the first hints of dawn crept through the trees, Claire understood something new. Sometimes the wild must teach its own lessons, and those willing to fight for the vulnerable would always find unlikely allies, even in the unlikeliest forms. In that battered clearing, surrounded by wounded, frightened creatures and defeated men, Claire felt the heartbeat of the forest settle once again. She gathered Rusty and the kitten, holding them close as the world turned slowly toward a new day. Dawn bled softly over the trees, burning away the last tatters of smoke and fear that had haunted the forest all night. The chaos of the poacher's attack, the confusion of flares and gunshots, gave way to a heavy, aching quiet that felt deeper than silence. For Claire, The relief was as sharp as pain. She crouched beside Rusty in the trampled snow, her hand shaking as she stroked his fur, feeling the stickiness of blood where the bullet had grazed his side. The wound was ugly, a raw line above his ribs, torn open when he'd thrown himself between her and danger. The Rangers had already finished their work, gathering the captured poachers and confiscating their weapons, dispersing the last traps. Radios crackled, boots churned the wet earth, but soon the valley emptied out again, leaving only Claire, Rusty, and the wounded Bobcat Kitten. The kitten's leg was swollen and raw from the snare, every movement a struggle, but still it limped along the edge of the clearing, nose high, gaze fixed on the shadows. Instinct, even after all it had endured, kept pulling it away from comfort, away from the warmth of the fire, away from human hands. Inside the cabin, Claire set about the quiet work of survival. She boiled water, cleaned Rusty's wound with gentle hands, and wrapped his ribs in strips of bandage torn from an old sheet. He accepted her care with stoic patience, flinching only when the antiseptic stung. All the while his eyes tracked the Bobcat Kitten, as if still guarding it even in safety. The bond between dog and wildcat, tested by terror, seemed at once unbreakable and impossibly fragile. She treated the kitten's leg with equal care, holding it close despite its trembling, whispering encouragement that was met with only wide, wild eyes. The animal accepted her touch now, but no longer pressed close for comfort. Instead, it stared toward the window, to the open world beyond. Every time Claire set it down, the kitten dragged itself away, trying to reach the door, the forest, the unknown. Claire understood that longing. She had seen it in wounded deer, in orphaned raccoons and foxes, the wild's relentless pull. Survival was not enough. Freedom was written in the bones of every creature born beneath these trees. As the days blurred together, she saw the change in the kitten. It grew restless, less trusting, its movements sharper and more purposeful. It no longer snuggled beside Rusty at night, but slept curled on the far side of the room, one wary eye always open. For Rusty, the change brought confusion and a subtle ache. He limped from his bed to the spot where the kitten slept, only to pause and retreat, sensing the invisible barrier that had grown between them. He would rest his head on his paws and watch, tail twitching with each movement, understanding somehow that the little creature he had saved was slipping away from him, drawn by forces neither of them could resist. Claire felt it too, a bittersweet ache that mingled with her relief. They had paid a price for survival. Rusty's wound would leave a scar. Her own shoulder ached from where she'd tumbled in the scramble, and the Bobcat Kitten would never again be as tame or trusting as in those first hours after the river. She tried to remind herself this was right. This was natural. The wild does not keep what it does not own. Nights grew longer as spring hesitated on the horizon. Sometimes, as the moonlight swept over the clearing, Claire would catch sight of the kitten at the window, silhouetted in silver, eyes reflecting the woods beyond. Once or twice she caught it practicing its silent stalk, creeping after a beetle or leaf, claws unsheathing and tail twitching with instinct. Its world was shrinking. No longer the cabin, no longer Rusty's side, but something far larger and more dangerous that called from just beyond the glass. The hardest lesson was letting go. Claire had seen it countless times. Creatures rescued and raised, only to return to the wild that shaped them. She knew this bond was never meant to last. What she and Rusty had given the Bobcat Kitten was not a home, but a second chance. Now its survival depended on reclaiming the life it was born for, still, letting go hurt. Some nights Claire sat by the fire, shoulder throbbing, listening to the steady rhythm of Rusty's breathing, and wondered if the kitten would remember them, remember the warmth, the gentleness, the fierce battle they fought together. Would it think of the loyal dog who risked everything to pull it from the river? Or would those memories fade, washed away by new seasons and wild hunts? She watched Rusty watch the kitten, both of them caught in the silent understanding that love sometimes means stepping back, sometimes means pain. The wild had always demanded sacrifice, of comfort, of certainty, of the easy illusion of safety. But in that sacrifice, something rare was born, respect and a kind of love that asks for nothing in return. Spring would come soon enough, melting the last of the snow, stirring new hunger and restlessness in every living thing. For now, the cabin held 3 survivors, bound by the price of courage and the wild's promise that everything, joy, pain, even love, is fleeting. As the embers dimmed and another long night began, Claire pressed her palm to Rusty's side, feeling the steady thump of his heart. The wild outside waited, patient and eternal. Inside, they savored a fragile peace, knowing nothing could stay unchanged. But everything they'd done, every scar and every kindness, had mattered. Spring came late to the high country, as if the land itself hesitated to believe the violence of winter had finally passed. But with each passing day, the air softened and warmed, and green shoots pierced the battered earth where the snow had melted away. The river, once swollen and wild, now flowed clear and steady, its banks littered with new grass and the tender beginnings of wildflowers. For Claire, these small changes marked the slow return of hope, a gentler world emerging from beneath the scars of storm and survival. Inside the cabin, the changes were just as profound. The Bobcat Kitten had grown stronger each day, its limp almost gone, its leg healing with a stubborn resilience that left Claire both relieved and oddly proud. Gone was the trembling, half-drowned bundle of fur Rusty had pulled from the flood. In its place was a sleek, wary creature with sharp eyes and an unbreakable spirit. The kitten moved with a confidence that belonged to the wild, not the homey safety of 4 wooden walls. For weeks, Claire had watched this transformation with a bitter-sweet ache. She knew what it meant, knew that the day would come when she would have to return the bobcat to the forest that had nearly claimed it. She'd seen it before in the fawns, the raccoons, the orphaned foxes she'd nursed back from the edge. No matter how deep the bond, nature always reclaimed its own. Still, saying goodbye was never easy. As the days grew longer and the valley burst into color, Claire began to prepare the kitten for its new life. She led it and Rusty each morning to a semi-wild enclosure on the edge of the park, a space built with high wire and plenty of trees, logs, and underbrush. Here, the kitten could practice what instinct demanded: stalking, pouncing, climbing, hiding. Claire watched with a mixture of awe and sadness as it learned to catch live mice, to vanish into the shadows, to move like a whisper through tall grass. Rusty watched too, nose pressed to the wire, tail wagging with excitement whenever the kitten showed a flash of its wild heritage. There were moments, tiny, almost invisible, when the kitten seemed to remember the warmth of the cabin. It would pause, glancing back toward Claire or Rusty, hesitation flickering in its golden eyes. Sometimes it brushed past Rusty, as if to thank him, only to dart away again, disappearing into the tangled brush. Claire tried to keep herself busy. She fixed fence posts, mended tools, and kept the wildlife log for the rangers. But her gaze was always drawn back to the enclosure, to the small, fierce animal she and Rusty had saved. There was a gravity to these last days, a sense of something both ending and beginning. On the morning of the release, the air was so clear and sharp it seemed to vibrate. Dew sparkled on every blade of grass, and birds called from the budding trees. Claire moved quietly, her heart heavy and her hands steady. She opened the gate and waited. Rusty sat beside her, calm but alert, ears flicking as he listened to the sounds of the waking world. The Bobcat Kitten stepped through the open gate, tail low and body tense. For a moment, it lingered, looking back at Claire and Rusty, eyes wide and uncertain. The memory of warmth, of hands that had healed, of the great dog who had rescued it from the river. These things must have lingered, if only for an instant. Then, with a shiver, the kitten turned, slipped into the high grass, and vanished between the trees. Claire stood very still, arms crossed over her chest, the ache of letting go blooming in her heart. Rusty remained silent at her side, gaze fixed on the place where the kitten had disappeared. Time stretched, silent except for the wind whispering through the pines. In that quiet, Claire understood the truest lesson of all. Loving the wild meant knowing when to let it go. The bond they'd built was real, but it was never meant to last. The gift she'd given the kitten was not a home, but freedom, the only true kindness the wild could accept. Rusty seemed to sense it too. He rose and nosed Claire's hand, leaning against her leg with gentle weight. For a long moment, they watched the tree line, hoping for one last glimpse, one final connection before the world pulled the kitten back into its own rhythms. They walked back to the cabin in silence. The rooms felt emptier, the corners more hollow without the small presence lurking in the shadows. Yet there was peace, too, a sense that something had come full circle, that the valley was once again as it should be. In the evenings, Claire sometimes sat on the porch with Rusty, sipping coffee as the sun slipped behind the pines. She wondered where the Bobcat Kitten had gone, what dangers and adventures it might face, and if, in the hush between one breath and the next, it ever remembered the hands and hearts that had fought to keep it alive. Perhaps one day she would catch sight of a grown bobcat at the edge of the woods, poised, powerful, and utterly free, and know in her bones that their stories would always be linked by the river, the storm, and the wild, unwavering courage that lived in them all. The days after the farewell slipped quietly into the rhythm of a Montana spring. Life in the valley resumed its slow, deliberate pace. The river, tamed for now, glittered beneath the midday sun. Pine needles released their scent as the last snow melted, and elk returned to graze along the open meadows. To an outsider, it might have seemed as if nothing had changed. But for Claire, everything was different. In the weeks since the Bobcat Kitten's release, Claire found herself watching the forest with new eyes. Each sunrise carried a subtle ache, a reminder of the fragile bond that had formed, and then, as nature demanded, had been released. The cabin that once echoed with the soft, uncertain footfalls of a wild thing now held a quieter peace. Rusty, too, moved with a new gravity. He patrolled the porch and the yard, ever alert, but when he paused at the tree line, nose lifted to the wind, Claire wondered if he searched for the scent of their lost companion. Her shoulder still twinged on cold mornings, a souvenir from the desperate rescue. Rusty's wound, though healed, left a pink line beneath his fur. These scars, she knew, would fade in time. But the memory of that storm, of the wild river and the impossible odds, would linger far longer. On quiet afternoons, She sat at her writing desk and opened her old leather-bound ranger's journal, the one she had started her first season in the park. The pages, stained and dog-eared, bore witness to years of struggle and triumph, routine and crisis. This time, though, her words came with a new humility. She wrote slowly, letting her thoughts unfurl like a trail through unbroken snow. Rusty showed me that loyalty isn't only to people, it's to every fragile life out there. He taught me that courage can come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the wildest hearts are the ones that teach us the meaning of compassion. She paused, her pen hovering above the page. She thought of the Bobcat Kitten, its trembling body rescued from the flood, its wild eyes staring back at her from the safety of the cabin, its restless spirit pressing always toward the window, the forest, the unknown. She remembered the feeling of letting go, the ache in her chest as it slipped into the trees. That was the truth at the heart of it. In the wild, nothing is ever truly ours to keep. The seasons moved forward. The stories of the winter storm and the poacher's defeat made their way through ranger meetings and into the local news. Neighbors stopped by the cabin to marvel at Rusty's bravery and to ask after the little bobcat. Claire recounted the story with quiet pride, careful to remind them that the true hero was not just a loyal dog, but the fragile thread of life itself that connects all creatures, wild or tame. With time, the wild returned to its ordinary miracles. She saw fresh paw prints by the river, too large for a kitten now. Once at dusk, she glimpsed a solitary figure slipping through the underbrush, silent and strong, tail flicking before vanishing into the shadows. She smiled, heart swelling with hope. Maybe it was their bobcat, thriving at last in the world where it belonged. Yet the lesson lingered, deeper than any memory. Claire understood, now more than ever, the limits of what it meant to protect, to heal, to love. She could offer shelter, courage, a fighting chance. But in the end, she could only hold the wild for a moment. Never claim it, never tame it, only honor it as it moved on. In her journal, she wrote one last entry beneath the story of the flood and the storm. We never truly own nature. We can only protect it for a time. And in protecting it, we are changed, shaped by the wild even as we try to shape it in return. Rusty seemed to sense the shift. As the days lengthened and the forest filled with birdsong, he grew more content, accepting the quiet as part of the price of loyalty. He would still prick his ears at the cry of a hawk, or nose the air when a wild scent drifted in. But he no longer searched for the kitten at the door. The valley, too, held its peace. Where the old bridge had been, Claire and her fellow rangers built a simple footpath, marked by a small plaque, in honor of the wild lives saved and the wild hearts who saved them. Visitors paused to read the words, some pausing longer than others, perhaps hearing echoes of their own stories in the silence. Claire continued her work in the park, teaching school groups about the balance of nature, the costs and rewards of courage, and the humility demanded by the wild. She shared Rusty's story, not as a tale of triumph, but as a lesson in letting go, in loving fiercely, and in knowing when to step back. Sometimes, at the end of her tours, she would look out at the faces gathered before her, children, parents, travelers from far away, and she would ask, "If it were you, would you let your dog risk everything to save a wild animal? Would you fight for something you could never keep? Would you let go for the sake of freedom?" She saw uncertainty, wonder, even a touch of awe reflected back at her. And always, as she closed her talks, she encouraged them. Share your story, protect the wild things, if only for a while. And remember, the world needs more hearts brave enough to let go. On the porch at dusk, as Rusty dozed at her feet and the forest shifted toward evening, Claire knew she would carry the lesson of that storm and that little bobcat kitten for the rest of her days. The wild had changed her, as it changes everyone it touches, asking for courage, patience, and the willingness to say goodbye. And if anyone were to ask, she would tell them, let the wild go when it's time. But never forget the difference you made when you held on.